Good day, everyone. I am Rumana Huq, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. I welcome you all to the webinar on Tobacco Economics Cigarette Tax Scorecard Spotlight on Bangladesh. On December 15, 2020, Tobacco Economics released the first edition of the International Cigarette Tax Scorecard, assessing the performance of cigarette tax policies in over 170 countries. The Tobacco Economics Cigarette Tax Scorecard scores cigarette tax policy performance in over 170 countries on a 5-point scale using data from the WHO global reports on the tobacco epidemic. This report provides policymakers with an actionable assessment of their country's cigarette tax policy. Today, we have distinguished panelists and speakers with us who will discuss the Tobacco Economics Cigarette Tax Scorecard for Bangladesh. We have Professor Frank J. Chaloupka, University of Illinois at Chicago. We have Nigar Nargis from American Cancer Society, Barrister Shameem Haider Patwary, MP, Bangladesh Parliament, and Dr. Syed Mahfuzul Huq, National Professional Officer, NCD, World Health Organization. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar. First, I would request Professor Dr. Frank Chaloupka to present. Before that, I will give a brief introduction of Dr. Chaloupka. He is a research professor in the Division of Health Policy and Administration of the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Public Health. He is an economist internationally recognized for his study of the economics of tobacco control. Professor Chaloupka's research interests include the impact of economic policy and other environmental influences on health behaviors and the economics of tobacco and tobacco control, particularly in developing countries. I now request Professor Frank to present his presentation. Over to you, Professor Frank.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. So thanks, Romana. As Romana described, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Tobacconomics Cigarette Tax Scorecard that we have been developing over the past year and that was released a few months ago. And then talk specifically about the scoring for Bangladesh and some suggestions on how cigarette tax could be improved in Bangladesh. So in the scorecard, we try to take a comprehensive look at how governments are taxing cigarettes around the world and really focus on different dimensions of their cigarette tax systems. In the past, there hasn't been this sort of comprehensive effort. People have largely focused on one of the components, the share of the tax in retail cigarette prices. But what we've learned over time is that that's really not going to give a good indication of everything that goes into maximizing the effectiveness of cigarette taxes in both generating revenues and in promoting public health. We've seen, for example, that countries can have high shares of taxes but still have very low cigarette prices. And it's really price that's going to drive a lot of the behaviors that we see around cigarette smoking. Important also is going to be how the affordability of cigarettes is changing over time. We've learned that particularly in low and middle income countries where economies are growing rapidly, even when prices are increasing, even when taxes are increasing, we can see increases in income that are more rapid than those increases in prices. And as a result, affordability of cigarettes is increasing. So a real key is to make sure that the affordability is going down over time in order to really reduce tobacco use, reduce cigarette smoking. And then the last key feature that we focus on is going to be the cigarette tax structure. Again, one of the things that we've learned from research over the last 10 years is that the type of tax that's being applied is going to be very, very important in affecting overall tobacco use. To the extent that governments use more complicated tax structures that rely more on ad valorem taxes, this creates a lot of variability in prices. It creates opportunities for tax avoidance. It allows for smokers to be able to switch down to cheaper brands, for example, when cigarette taxes are going up. And what we've learned is that more simple specific taxes or mixed systems that rely more on specific taxes are going to be more effective in the end in reducing tobacco use. So again, what we've done is to compile the data that we have from the WHO's reports on the global tobacco epidemic. These reports come out every 2 years, and we've used the data from the last several reports to go ahead and construct these scores. So we're looking at data from the reports that reported on what was happening in 2018, 2016, and 2014. We construct these scores to reflect the strength of government's cigarette tax systems in each of these years, and then also look at how things have changed over time. This is something that we spent the last year developing. It's something that's gone through extensive peer review with economists, with policymakers, with others from pretty much around the world. And we really try to highlight in developing the scores some of the guidance that we get from various sources. And in particular, we focus on the guidelines for the implementation of Article 6 of the WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And we also highlight some recommendations that come from the World Health Organization, from the World Bank, and again, recommendations that are really based on the research evidence. So as Ramana said, we've pulled together the data for over 170 countries across these 3 different periods. And we can see when we look at the scores that there is considerable variation globally in how countries are doing with their cigarette tax systems. So countries that are darker on this map, darker blue, are going to be the countries that score higher on our 5-point scale. Countries that are lighter, the more light gray colors, are going to be ones that score relatively poorly on the scale. And then there are some countries for which we don't have data. If we look at what's happening around the world, we can see that on average, countries are doing fairly poorly. Again, this is a 5-point scale. The global average is just over 2. So again, considerable room for improvement globally in terms of the way that governments are taxing cigarettes. A lot of variability regionally. The African region does the worst. The European region does the best. But even in the European region, they're still scoring below 3 on average, suggesting again that there is considerable room for improvement in their cigarette tax systems. When we look across countries at different income levels, we can see that there is a pretty clear gradient with income. Higher income countries tend to be doing better. Lower income countries tend to be doing worse on the scale. If we look at the top performing countries, at this point, the 2 highest scoring countries on our scorecard are Australia and New Zealand. They score an average of 4.6, so pretty close to that 5-point maximum. They're doing very well for a few reasons. They score well on every component. They have very simple, uniform, specific excise tax structures. Both countries regularly update their taxes to account for inflation and income growth. Shares of taxes are very high. They have some of the highest taxes in the world, as a result, some of the highest cigarette prices in the world. And they have these regular extra normal tax increases beyond those inflation adjustments that push down the affordability of cigarettes. So again, they're doing very well relative to the rest of the world. If we look at Bangladesh in particular, we see Bangladesh is doing relatively well in some sense, and not doing as well as those highest performing countries, but doing better than what we see globally. So Bangladesh comes in at a score of 2.38 on our scale, a bit better than the global average. And then comparing it to other countries in its region, other countries at the same income level, again, we can see that Bangladesh is doing relatively well compared to these other countries. So again, not quite half of the potential 5 points that they could get on our scale, but overall doing well compared to some of the other countries that are really its peers. If we look across the different components of the score, what we see is that Bangladesh does well when it comes to the tax share, scoring 3.5 out of the possible 5 points, with taxes accounting for a relatively large share of price. And it's doing well because in recent years, taxes have gone up by enough to raise prices so that prices have risen faster than income and the affordability of cigarettes is going down. Where Bangladesh doesn't do as well is on the other two components. Even though tax share is relatively high, even though affordability is going down, cigarettes are still relatively cheap in Bangladesh, relatively low priced. And then in particular, the tax structure, I think, is part of what contributes to that. So again, tax structure, the score there is only 1 out of the possible 5. And that's because Bangladesh uses a fairly complicated tax structure. It uses a tiered ad valorem tax where the tax rate varies based on the price of cigarettes. And again, that ad valorem component to the tax implies that there's going to be a lot of variability in price, a lot of opportunities for smokers to switch to cheaper brands as taxes and prices are going up. So even though affordability is going down, prices are still low, and there are these opportunities for trading down to cheaper brands. If we look at how Bangladesh has done over time, what we see is that there has been some improvements. And the improvement is really because of this reduction in affordability that I was talking about. So between 2016 and 2018, we saw some tax increases that, for the most popular brand of cigarettes that were enough to reduce the affordability of cigarettes. And that really generated an increase in the overall score for Bangladesh in the scorecard. So again, if we look at how things are going in Bangladesh, again, the country is doing relatively well in terms of reducing affordability of cigarettes in recent years. And it does have taxes that do account for a significant share of the retail prices of cigarettes. But despite having those high shares, cigarette prices continue to be relatively low in Bangladesh. So a lot of room for improvement in terms of pushing prices higher. Price is really going to be a key driver in terms of reducing the consumption of cigarettes, overall cigarette smoking. And I think the biggest challenge there is this complicated tax structure, this tiered ad valorem tax structure that, again, really creates opportunities for smokers to avoid increases in taxes by trading down to cheaper brands. And at the same time, also makes it much more difficult to administer relative to a simple, uniform, specific tax. So again, Bangladesh doing well compared to the rest of the world, compared to other countries in the region, compared to other countries at its income level, but still considerable room to improve the cigarette tax system there in a way that would maximize its health impacts, that would maximize the revenue impacts from the tax. So again, that was a very quick introduction to the scorecard. You can find the overall reports, country-specific information specific to Bangladesh on our website. Follow us on Tobacconomics and follow up with me and others on the team if you have any specific questions. So we'll have some time at the end to talk more, to take questions, but now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Nigar Nargis at the American Cancer Society. Back to you, Romana.
Thank you, Professor Frank. It was really useful to understand the tax score, and it really shows that though Bangladesh is doing relatively well, and if we compare to other neighboring countries or low-income countries, we are doing well, but there is still scope to improve the tax structure, especially the complicated tax system, and which really encourages to switch to cheaper brand cigarettes. So these are really helpful discussion, and I request all the participants to write in the chat box if you have any question. So we will take your question at the end of the discussions. So please do write your questions in the chat box. I now request Dr. Nigar Nargis to present. Just to say a few words that Dr. Nigar Nargis is an expert in economic and health policy research work, and which really promotes the prevention of cancer and other non-communicable diseases. And she really helps people to follow a healthy lifestyle through avoidance of tobacco use and unhealthy drinking habits, using her research findings and advocacy and her technical support to many low and middle income countries. Welcome, Dr. Nigar Nargis, and over to you.
Thank you, Romana. It's a great pleasure to be able to present the cigarette tax proposal that different partner organizations have been working on for the reform in cigarette tax policies in Bangladesh. So I am going to present the specific recommendations that came out of the joint collaboration of the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the Union, Tobacconomics, Vital Strategies, and the World Health Organization. So this tax proposal is developed every year prior to the budgetary session that begins from June and continues for the fiscal year until the June next year. So since 2018, all these partner organizations have been collaborating to provide support to the agenda of tobacco taxation as part of the tobacco control initiative in Bangladesh, and they communicate this proposal to the government, specifically to the National Board of Revenue. This year, specifically, we took into account the recommendations that came out of the Cigarette Tax Scorecard that Frank just presented. And also, we took into account the longer-term perspective of how to achieve the goal of a tobacco-free Bangladesh in the near term. So that's the background of this proposal, and now I would move into the slides. Next slide, please. As Frank has already mentioned, that the cigarette tax structure in Bangladesh is tiered. Ad valorem tax rates are applied to 4 different tiers. Since 2006-07, we have seen historically these 4 different tiers are evolving in a way that the prices the gaps between the prices are increasing over time. So the gap between the low tier and the premium tier has significantly increased over the last 15 years. On average, the price, which is given by the weighted average of all these prices, weighted by the consumption of cigarettes in different tiers, has also been increasing. And this is not significant increase as we have seen in the scorecard presentation, that the prices are still low compared to the regional and global standards. But it is increasing, and it has actually contributed to the reduction in smoking of cigarettes in Bangladesh. Next slide, please. When we adjust these prices for inflation, we still see that there is some moderate increase and persistence of the price differential between the high and low tiers. Next slide, please. Then we compare these prices to the growth in gross national income per capita. As we are all aware of the spectacular growth performance of Bangladesh over the last decade or so, the prices of cigarettes have actually maintained pace with a growth, especially in the last 5 years. If you look at the trend between 2015-16 to 2019-20, we see that expenditure on cigarettes as a percentage of gross national income per capita has been trending upward, which indicates that the affordability of cigarettes is gradually decreasing in Bangladesh. Next slide, please. And we observe that the cigarette sale, after increasing for many years, now it has finally started to slide downward, especially in the last fiscal year from 2018-19 to 2019-20, there was a significant decrease. And when we look at the breakdown of the sales by the price tiers, which is in the next slide, we see that the overall decrease in cigarette sales has been driven by the decrease in sales in the low price tier, which has been partially compensated by increase in sales in the medium tier, but overall there has been a decrease in cigarette sales. Next slide, please. So for developing that cigarette tax proposal, we envisioned a trajectory of cigarette prices over a period of 5 years, which shows the current prices in 2020-21 and how it would evolve for each tier over time, so that gradually there will be a convergence of prices between the medium and low tier and between the premium and the high tier. So eventually we will be able to reduce the number of tiers from 4 to 2. And by the end of this 5-year period, there will be approximately doubling of the price, specifically in the mid-tier, mid and low tier. So that would help us achieve the goal of a smoke-free Bangladesh in the near term. Although it looks, the trajectory looks pretty flat, but getting there up to 90 taka per pack of cigarettes in the low and medium tier and 160 taka per pack of cigarettes in the upper 2 tiers, there will be a number of political barriers that we need to jump over. And the partner organizations every year, they are collaborating with the National Board of Revenue to reconcile those challenges and trying their best to achieve this goal. The next slide, please. So this price trajectory implies that the tax rates at each tier that need to be achieved would look like the ones that are shown in this graph. Again, these tax rates would be converging over the next 5-year period. One point that I would like to highlight here is that all these tax rates represent 65% of the final price that I showed in the previous slide. And as Frank mentioned in his presentation on the tax scorecard, that Bangladesh is lagging behind with respect to the tax structure because it has a very complex tax structure with 4 different tax rates in 4 tiers, which the ad valorem tax rate has become uniform in the top 3 tiers, but it is still lower in the bottom tier. Now, this tax system that is proposed is actually quite different from the existing system because it represents a tiered specific system which would replace the tiered ad valorem system. And then gradually it will merge the tiers to reduce it from 4 to 2 at the end of this 5-year period. Next slide, please. For the next fiscal year, the specific recommendations are summarized in these 2 tables. So the table on the left shows the current rates corresponding to the 4 tiers. In Bangladesh, the cigarette excise tax is known as the supplementary duty, and there is also 15% value-added tax on the final retail price, and also 1% health development surcharge on top of these taxes. In the envisioned path, we propose that the tax share in the retail price would be 65% uniform over all the tiers, but the specific tax per pack would be different across its different tiers, which would gradually move to 2 tiers over the 5-year period. Next slide, please. So in summary, this proposed tax reform entails a significant increase in cigarette prices, introduction of tiered specific excise in place of ad valorem excise system for cigarettes, and reduction of the gaps in final price and tax rates between cigarette brands, which would limit the ability of smokers to substitute to cheaper brands when there is tax and a price increase. The next slide, please. We have also looked at the expected health and economic outcomes of these proposed tax increases. On average, it will increase the price of cigarettes by 26%, and it will reduce total cigarette sales by 1 billion packs. The tax revenue would increase by about 30 billion Bangladeshi taka. The industry revenue, on the other hand, will reduce by 6 billion taka. The smoking prevalence would decrease by 1 percentage point, resulting in 1.1 million fewer adult smokers, and also about 1 million fewer young smokers. Eventually, the number of lives saved from reducing the number of smokers would be approximately 800,000. So that's all I had to share from the cigarette tax proposal from our partners. Please feel free to raise your questions. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Dr. Nigar. You mentioned that there is still scope for a significant increase in cigarette prices, and you emphasized on restructuring the tax system, especially reducing the tiers of tax and in next 5 years to make it from 4 tiers to 2 tiers. And you also showed that this will increase the government revenue as well as reduce the industry revenue. So thank you so much for your presentation. I will now request our first panelist, Barrister Shameem Haider Patwary, Honorable Member of Parliament, Bangladesh Parliament. So, Dr. Shameem Haider Patwary, you are a tobacco control activist and our leader. So we would really like to hear from you that from these two presentations, we got some guideline that how our tax system should be in Bangladesh. So we would like to know from you that what is the plan of the government and how you see the entire system and how we can proceed forward to achieve these targets. Over to you, Barrister Shameem Haider Patwary.
Thank you, Romana. I have keenly noticed and listened to the two wonderful presentations and wholeheartedly support the proposal. And almost all tobacco control activists who are working in this field it is so convincing, it is so logical, it is so rational, it is so beneficial, and any activist will be wholeheartedly support it. Then the question is how to implement it. That's become the problem. We all know the disease, the prescription and medicine, and its implementation becoming the problem. Because I am working in this field, in the tobacco tax field, not working, observing for last 2-3 years, it's becoming almost impossible to penetrate in the government scheme. And during the COVID, government is always very shaky about the economy, about the excise, about the collection of revenue. And I'm sure they will be very conservative in any form of amendment, or they'll be conservative in any form of modification, alteration. But we have done something recently, this is very notable. 193 under the leadership of Habibe Millad, we formed a parliamentary forum on health rights advocacy. And 193 MPs signed in favor of banning the e-cigarette. So this is some really exceptional we have done. So if you can sensitize over 100 members of issue and about the abolition or reduction of tier system, imposition of a specific tax or ad valorem tax, whatever. So these things are so convincing. We can really able to convince them. And if hundreds MPs give their demand order or DO or supporting signature or anything, then it will have some biting power. Otherwise, what will happen? We can raise this issue in the parliament in the June session. Of course, I will raise that. I will wholeheartedly support this structure or proposed structure. I will place it before the parliament, or if I get chance, 1 or 2 minutes. But then again, the outcome is that in Bangladesh, budget is placed before the parliament, and with slight modification, the parliament passed it. So this is now March, and it is very important you collect demand DO or signatures from the member of parliament and do advocacy in NBR, do advocacy in PM office, do advocacy with the finance minister, health minister, and then we can, if you can really prepare something in the budget, in the draft budget, then it's easier to pass. But if something is not in the draft budget, it is almost impossible to make a subsequent insertion or subsequent radical change in the structure. So I am completely in favor of abolition of tier system. Also, in your research or proposal, there are a number of tobacco product which is not even within the tier system. The jorda, the gul, the open leaf, the raw tobacco leaf. I told it every time because I'm from a very village and very poor constituency area. I know people take raw tobacco. So huge number of raw tobacco people are consuming without any pictorial warning, without any packing, without any tax, without any consumption. I doubt whether your research data include those raw tobacco consumption or not, because if we add those figure, the studies could have been otherwise. So that's also another problem we are facing. So if you want to really press hard for this reduction of tier system within 5 years and the target of reduction of consumption, of course we have to lobby within parliament and lobby in the lobby of parliament. That's so important. So all the stakeholders we're working in tobacco tax or tobacco anti-tobacco field, we should take responsibility for 1, 2, or 3 member of parliaments and collecting demand orders and organize a Zoom meeting or physical meeting within 7 to 10 days. Time is very essential. So within 7 to 10 days, if we can arrange a physical meeting on tobacco taxation and collect their consent paper and collect their signatures in support of your this proposal or research proposal, I think that can have some biting power in the policy level, and the Honorable Prime Minister can then really feel to adopt it. It is so important that she feel to adopt it, and it is her commitment. She wants to make the country to a structured path. And that is also important. We don't have the structured pathway up to 2040. So if we have a structured pathway, of course, tobacco taxation, a reduction of tier system, and that will be included in the pathway, then we can really force that. That is within the framework. We have to do it by this year or 2 or 5 years. So I think this time it's a high time to make some some meeting to influence the member of parliament, even the backbencher member of parliament, and also parliamentary forum on health rights advocacy can also play some role. I'll try to make an agenda in the next meeting of parliamentary forum on health rights advocacy to include tobacco tax and abolition or reduction of tier system there, so that they also do advocacy and issue demand order. So I'm fully convinced and totally agreed with the proposal, and it's backed by research. It is backed by convincing logical arguments, the argument which no one can really overcome. All we have to look into, it should be in the draft budget statement. That is important. How we can achieve that, how we can reflect it as a backbencher opposition member of parliament. I can raise the issue in the parliament. I can make a prolonged speech in the parliament, but I cannot prepare the draft. That's the issue. The draft is prepared initially by the bureaucrats, of course, and then it was modified by ministers and prime ministers. Sometimes it's happened the draft was suddenly changed in tobacco tax issues. We have seen that. We call this ghost insertion. Sometimes it's happened, the NBR is agree, every minister is agree about the reform, then suddenly there is a change in the draft. And no one knew about it. Suddenly it came to the parliament. It happens in anti-tobacco in tobacco field, or it happens in tobacco taxation. So that also we need to guard it and check that the ghost should not insert some unholy insertion in the draft. So thank you, everybody. It's a wonderful session. I have to attend another meeting, but I will stay connected, and I'll note down the summary, and I myself will place it in different forums, including the House. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Rumana.
Thank you, Barrister Shameem Haider Patwary, Member of Parliament, Bangladesh Parliament, for joining us and for your commitment to raise these issues to the Parliament. And we hope that one day we will achieve our target with the support from you and all other Member of Parliaments and also tobacco control advocates who are working hard on this agenda. I will now go to our last panelist, Dr. Syed Mahfuzul Huq, National Professional Officer, NCD World Health Organization. Dr. Mahfuz, you have heard the presentations and also reflection from our other panelists. So I would like to know your reflection and your opinion about the issue of today's webinar. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Romana. We have been listening to the very experienced academicians and also policymakers on the issue. I would say that Dr. Frank and Dr. Nigar has very nicely presented the current problems that we have regarding the price and tax of tobacco products in Bangladesh, especially about the very cheap tobacco products price is indeed very low. So no matter how much tax you put in percentage form over a very low base price, it makes little difference, especially from the public health perspective, because the consumer is sensitive to the price, not to the percentage of the tax which is there within the price. And also we have heard about the tax structure. I would say that in the two presentations, there were elements of hope, elements of encouragement, and also there were, areas which were shown very clearly where we can make more improvements. Uh, One area I would like to draw attention to, which Barrister Shameem Haider Patwary has talked about a bit, is that it is more the presentations and discussions were basically about the cigarette, but as we know, a large number of population are consuming uh, smokeless tobacco, and on top of that bidi is also there, and tax as well as the price on these products are also very low. These are also major issues, and particularly for the smokeless tobacco, the problem is that the whole industry is mostly, a large part of the industry is beyond the formal market and the formal tax net. So these are being also discussed whenever the tax is being discussed on top of cigarette tax, biri, tax on biri and tax on SLT is also discussed. The problems are, we all know about it. About the solution, or about the tax proposal that Dr. Nigar has presented, it was developed, as we all know, by a number of organizations. It is a joint proposal. It was developed after a lot of consultation. But if we look at it, there is a paradigm shift. For last many years, we were proposing in one way, but after a lot of consultation this year, The proposal is kind of unique in a sense that we are now proposing 4 tiers with a specific tax. Dr. Nigar has very nicely presented the argument in favor of this paradigm shift. So the advantage is that if it is accepted, it will definitely have a positive impact both on the revenue and public health. But the problem that Barrister Shameem Haider was mentioning is that under current situation, uh, I mean, uh, a, a shift, a paradigm shift, or a major change on the structure. We are yet to see how the government reacts to it because of a number of reasons, including the COVID and the revenue and etc. Barriers to the way forward. Again, Barrister Shameem Haider has very nicely said that over the years, international organizations, tobacco control activists, and the civil society and the academicians all are talking to the governments before the national budget about changing the structure of the tobacco tax, especially to make it less affordable, etc. It's a long journey. However, as Dr. Shameem was, Barrister Shameem was very rightly saying, and we also know about it, that I mean, some ghost influence is always there. We don't see those influences, but we can feel, and those influences are still there. So now it's basically the challenge is to take this proposal forward within this system, and to convince the government, to the policymakers, to accept it. I think I will stop here, and if required, I'll be coming back again during the question answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mahfouz, and thank you for raising the issue of smokeless tobacco, because we have received a number of questions around the scorecard of smokeless tobacco, any possibility for that. So maybe I will request Dr. Frank to respond to the question that whether there is any scope or plan to include smokeless tobacco for these type of scorecard analysis, because smokeless tobacco like Jorda Gul are really popular in developing countries like Bangladesh.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and as the different comments have pointed out and the questions have pointed out, that's a real issue in Bangladesh. So we are at this point relying on the data that comes from the WHO's reports on the global tobacco epidemic. One of the limitations of those data is that there are not comprehensive data on the taxation of other tobacco products. So that is a limitation of the scorecard. The scorecard focuses on cigarette taxes rather than overall tobacco tax systems. That said, we would ideally like to include that information as we go forward. So part of what we're hoping to be able to do is to expand the scorecard to account for other tobacco product taxation and also to account for the administration of tobacco taxes. And I think that's one of the big challenges with smokeless tobacco in Bangladesh is the tax administration. So we know from the guidelines, the WHO for the Framework Convention for Article 6, we know that the recommendation is to tax all tobacco products equivalently. We know in Bangladesh that the smokeless products are generally, I think, taxed lower than cigarettes are taxed. But then I think the biggest problem is the challenge associated with collecting those taxes. Quickly to summarize, the goal is to try to incorporate these other taxes going forward. We're doing some work to look at how best countries can implement smokeless tobacco taxes, and Bangladesh is one of the countries that we're focusing on in our work.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Nigar, I will come to you now. A number of questions to you. One is that you mentioned there will be a reduction in tax tier in next 5 years from 4 to 2. So one question is how you are going to, proposing to implement that. So what are the steps to be followed to reduce the tiers? And another question came a number of times that there are different types of tobacco products. cigarette, bidi, and smokeless tobacco, but the presentation mainly focuses on the cigarette. So what is your reflection on that? And please explain that for the next year's tobacco campaign, what should people do about the smokeless tobacco? So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. And I'm very happy to address those because we have discussed this extensively, as Dr. Mahfouz has mentioned earlier, among all the partners and who participated in the deliberations. So first, I would explain why we focused on cigarette tax reform only for this year, which is a deviation from the approach that has been taken so far until the last year. So we have identified that smokeless tobacco taxation is subject to some administrative challenges that NBR is facing to bring the informal sector, which is large in Bangladesh, to bring this large informal sector under the tax net, the NBR needs to work on the administrative side. So it is not going to help only to place the policy recommendations to raise the tax and prices on smokeless tobacco. So that's where they need to aim at, and we are actually working in collaboration with them to help figure that out, that how to address that administrative challenge. And the Tobacconomics team at UIC, they have already begun the process of collating the evidence base for this and coming up with policy recommendations. So the study is currently in process. That's what I wanted to share. There are still some studies that are being undertaken for collecting data. Unavailability of data is also another big challenge for undertaking any formal quantitative analysis for smokeless tobacco consumption. So we are working on that. We haven't forgotten about smokeless tobacco, that I wanted to assure. But we wanted to address cigarette taxation first because this is where currently within the smoked tobacco product landscape, cigarette consumption is the largest component. And this is also the highest revenue generating component of tobacco products. So NBR is also very interested to work on the reform of the tax structure that will serve both the revenue goals and the public health goals. So this is in the joint interest of public health community and the revenue authority to work on cigarette taxation. Biri taxation in itself is a very important area, but again, the consumption of biri has been declining over the last decade or so, and we know that people are they are able to afford cigarettes more than biri now. So we think that focusing on cigarette consumption is vital at this point to prevent a further uptake of cigarette consumption. And we will definitely look into biri taxation in the coming years. But for this year, we are focusing on the reform of the tax structure, which is in and of itself is very challenging because the proposal, it looks innocuous, but the implementation of this proposal is going to be very challenging. And I think that is reflected in everybody's discussion here today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if Barrister Shameem Haider MP if is with us. We have a few questions. One is that how to combat tobacco industry interference. I was interested to hear from Barrister Shameem Haider, but if
I can answer, but I cannot be turn on my video. Okay, it's dark. I can answer, no problem.
Sure, please. So the question is how to combat tobacco industry interference and how to also address the conflict of interest of government's role in the industry functioning or investment in the tobacco industry. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rumana. I know the question is completely indicating the government share in British American tobacco. It's a serious conflict of interest issue. On the one hand, we vowed to make this country tobacco free. We signed FCTC. We are framing legislations. We're talking about abolition of tobacco. On the other hand, government itself now holding share in British American tobacco. And what British American tobacco is doing, they are giving directorship with high range of salary and other perquisites to the government secretaries and other people to influence. So obviously, in that case, the government must release or all the shares from all tobacco companies. That's first point important. Second, last year I attended a BBCI conference, and I have noticed that they highlighted Japan Tobacco as one of the biggest investor in this country. So that's the indirect way of promotion. That's the indirect way of encouragement from a semi-government organization. Also this year, I just typing this question in the chat box that also this year the highest taxpayer in this country is a gul babshayi, is a gul producers, the jorda producers. An SLT producers company become the highest taxpayer in the whole country, all sector. So he is receiving the award. He's and he's getting the reception from the government. So these all things is indirectly doing promotion and indirectly involving government in some cases, or state machinery in some cases, in tobacco business, indirectly or indirectly somehow. So that we need a strict code of conduct, and that even if any tobacco companies amount of tax, we should give the highest taxpayers award. The highest taxpayers award rules should completely bar it. Anybody who can produce alcohol or tobacco or anything, or doing gambling business lawfully, whatever, he should not be given the highest taxpayers award. He should give the highest tax, but not that award. So this way, we need a code of conduct, and of course, as I told, the government must not be, because when we talk about government, it's basically bureaucracy and political executives. That's its government practically. So when a secretary or additional secretary or joint secretary become the director of a tobacco company, receiving perquisite benefits from that company, and he have friends in other ministry, he can really exert his or her influence in the whole bureaucracy, in the cabinet indirectly. So that must be stopped. Thank you, Rumana.
Thank you. My last question to Dr. Syed Mahfuzul Huq. So you have heard the policy prescription for next year. So do you perceive any challenge, or what is your suggestion or recommendation to take this agenda forward? Over to you, Dr. Mahfuz.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Romana. As has been, it all came out from the discussion that one is that no matter how good a proposal is placed to the National Board of Revenue, this proposal has to go through a process from the National Board of Revenue to the Ministry of Finance, to the Cabinet, to the Parliament, to be turned into the law. I mean, to impose, to make it realized, to make it implemented. So it's a kind of long path, and throughout this path, as has been mentioned repeatedly, we always experienced very strong industry influence. That is barrier number one. And again, as we discussed, this time we are having a completely, a new kind of proposal, a paradigm shift type of proposal, a specific tax proposal. So perhaps the policymakers should be a little more, cautious about, reviewing it. So I would say that from our side, the best thing we can do is to engage even more with the government counterparts, with the policymakers with the best possible arguments and with the best possible evidence showing the benefit both from the public health and from the revenue perspective. And to hope for the best, and I think that's the best we can do, and definitely we would do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mahfuz. I will come to Professor Frank Chaloupka now. So after all the discussion, if you have as a few words just to wrap up from your end. Dr. Frank.
So I just want to thank everybody for participating. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to the participants on the webinar. I think a lot of good questions have been raised. I think the evidence at this point is clear on what Bangladesh can do to strengthen its tax system, particularly when it comes to cigarettes. As has been pointed out, there are many challenges in implementing this, but we have the evidence. I think we know what the right path is. It's very good to hear the Member of Parliament talking about his support for this effort. So I think that things are moving in the right direction, and we will continue to be here to help support whatever efforts we can help with. So thank you all for your participation, and I wish you all the best of luck as we move forward with this.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. And Dr. Nigar, still questions are coming, and most questions are to you. And these are basically that how we can move ahead with the plan. I know you have said quite a lot, but people are still raising concern that why only cigarette and not smokeless tobacco. Definitely, you have already given the answers. But from your end, if any few words for the tobacco control advocates and also for the policymakers. On this agenda. Over to you.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I think that I have invested over a decade of my career to search for the answer for this question. So I am also on the same plane where you are from, asking these questions from. So. Yeah, we are working with the National Board of Revenue all these years to find solution for these challenges, and there are stakeholders who have conflicting interests. So there is always this struggle going on because when one group gains, the other group loses. It's a zero-sum game that when the industry wants to gain, public health loses. So this is a continuous fight. And one thing I want to mention that the tier tax structure originated from the desire of the government to provide protection to the domestic companies, the small scale companies that were mainly operating in the cheapest cigarette tiers. Now all the multinational companies, they have also entered the market for the more expensive and the cheaper brands. So they are all in competition, and there is no point of keeping this tier tax system to provide support to the domestic companies. So that argument is gone, but now we have to gain the trust of the NBR that this is in the best interest of both the revenue goal of the government and the public health goal to reduce the tiers and unify the tax system, which would help increase the prices more effectively and reduce cigarette consumption. The steps for this is we have already provided the roadmap for the next 5 years. How much we will be able to achieve, that is subject to a lot of constraints that you have already come across. But this is where we are now. We haven't so far provided such a concrete roadmap before. This is the first time we are sharing it publicly. So I would encourage everyone to pursue this roadmap from wherever they are working. So that would help provide the support of this proposal.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nigar, and thank you all the speakers and panelists for their excellent presentation and insightful discussion. And I also thank all the participants for joining this webinar. I think the messages are really clear that there are still scope to improve the tax structure in Bangladesh, and we have to impose the specific tax to reduce the differences across the different tax tiers. And also we have to move ahead as a team, and everybody should work together to achieve our agenda. Thank you everyone for joining. Hope to see you soon. Thanks everyone, and goodbye.